So just so that you're aware, I got the slides from Trash. Basically, that's the crux of this presentation.
Yes, I noticed that. That's just excuse me. Thanks. All right, shall we get going?
Yeah. So let me do one more thing here.
Also going through the decision tree before we get to Laura's issue. There's a spreadsheet in the issue track, which says original suggested route in terms of going from like mandatory to important or whatever the case is.
Okay.
So you might want to open that up as we're going through that issue so people can see it. And I think Laura's in the news.
Okay, yep, she's there.
With regard to the I'm sorry, you need to back up 2 steps. With regard to the spreadsheet?
Yeah, well, it says in the spreadsheet, here's how the text aligns to what she thinks the IETF values
Right.
are. And then she says, here's what the original marking is in terms of mandatory or important or what have you, and here's what she is suggesting based on the alignment.
Gotcha. I'm wondering if I was going to make mention of we're going to do a formal review with the Secretariat, but I wonder if we want to leave that aside until we get the formal review. But this is the spreadsheet you just sent us? Or?
No, it's been in there for a while.
The old spreadsheet. Okay.
Taking all the different things that are either mandatory or important
So
or whatever.
if things monkey quite a bit before we get to her issue, then I would say this probably needs to be.
And we may, one way or the other, say,
our new
let's
buckets,
delay that until we're going to do the formal thing. Okay, good. No, I appreciate it. We can get the blue sheets going.
Yep.
Do we need both?
Yeah, we should write the top part on there.
Are you ECK?
Yeah, ECKEL.
Today is
29th, is that what you said? Yeah.
okay.
Great.
We'll send them.
Yeah, I'll carry them out.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the meeting venue working group meeting. So we just started the blue sheets circulating around. I think we have one on each side of the room. Hopefully you'll have one come by you as you're coming in. And once they get to the back, maybe just let us know that they've made it to the back, and we'll see if we need to, set them through again.
Barry is doing note-taking for the session. Brian is relaying for Jabber, yes? Maybe, possibly. One or the other of Brian or Barry will be relaying for Jabber. So if you see them get to the mic, please give them some leeway. All right, and you are going to project over here. Has magic happened? Is that projector on? Lights blinking? All right.
Give it a second. Starting to count. Yep. All right.
Yay. All right.
And is that legible? Because we'll be using this for other things that are maybe have a little more value than.
Yeah.
Is that legible, or do you guys need it to be a bit bigger? Is that going to work size-wise? I think there's a little thing you can adjust right on it there. Okay. I think that should work. Okay. Great. I'll turn over to you. You can do that.
Okay. So we wanted to first give you a little update since the shuffle of personnel in the working group. Elliot's put out a version of the document just cleaning up a couple of things that we noticed in the list, but relatively simple stuff. Charles and I are still walking through the list. So the first thing I want to let you folks know is we're going to discuss what we have down as big open issues that need the face-to-face time today. But for instance, I've been looking through the list and saw a couple of things where people suggested text, didn't get discussed, and then never made it into the document one way or the other. And so I want to make sure that we've captured the issues that have gone along historically. So Charles and I are still working through that. That means that that stuff is going to be taken to the list. We want to get the hard stuff done as much as we can today, but there are still open issues. The other thing I want to mention, Charles and I sat down with some folks at the Secretariat to sort of track where they're at with the document. They've got a couple of issues that they've described. What we want to do, just by way of making the process with them easier, is give them the document to do a review in a sort of more formal way, so that they can go through the document formally, make any suggested changes or make any comments that they've got, and pass that back over to the working group so that we've got a clean copy from the Secretariat. So we're going to solicit that review. We'll get that onto the list and go forward there. Beyond that, and anything else? The order for today, we're going to do the main document, the one that Elliot is editing first. Elliot's got an issues list set up. As I said, we're going to be adding to that for the more minor stuff on the list. And then Elliot's going to run most of the discussion. I want to do the discussion on this question of what does mandatory mean, and I hope I've got a way to have that discussion without actually asking that particular question. And then we'll go through, given time, Suresh's draft, and our current schedule is fit for the hour-and-a-half slot we originally had, and thank you for your indulgence. Family emergencies are family emergencies, and we will stick to that schedule, but do know that we have the padding to go extra time if we need to.
And just one thing I wanted to add, when we get to to Elliot's presentation, the way we're going to try driving that is actually using the issues list. He's already entered all the issues into GitHub. We have the issues list there. It might be handy for you to follow along, but you don't actually need to. I'll be presenting that, the view from GitHub on the screen, and be adding comments based on what we come up with in this room to update those.
Any questions about the format or how we're going forward? Agenda bashing of sorts? Good. Yes? Oh, and blue sheets floating around. All right, so that's where we're at. Elliot, do you want me to start with the bigger topic? So I brought the flip chart, or I should say I asked for the flip chart just in case we're going to use it. The issue of what is mandatory, I took a look at the discussion, and I've been trying to get my head wrapped around it. And again, you'll indulge both of the chairs, I hope, that we're still trying to get our sea legs here. What I'd like to understand, reading through the list, reading through the document, my sense is we've got a couple of plausible definitions going on for what buckets particular criteria fall into. And what I'd like to hear from the room is some discussion about whether there are things on the list, or should be things on the list, that are what you might call drop-dead showstopper issues. That is, a criteria that we actually want to say to IAOC or the meetings committee, thou shalt not do this, even if it's not obvious. This one means we don't go unless you come back to the community and get approval to do so. Are there issues like that on the list, or should there be issues like that on the list? Are there issues where we have a line of some sort that is, you shall not cross, but otherwise within the category, it's discretion of the IAOC? And I'm thinking of the one that I noticed, and I'm not claiming it is one or the other. Wheelchair access seems like that sort of category to me, where we know that that must be available, but how that's available, the particulars of how that's implemented, are to the discretion of the meetings committee or the discretion of the meeting planner. And then there are things in the category that I would say are strictly discretionary. We note this as an issue, as a criteria, as a thing of importance, but how this is accomplished is figured out by the meetings committee and weighed against other things. Those seem like the three sorts of things that we're talking about. I want to know if I've captured the three sorts of things and examples of things that might fall into each of those buckets. Fred.
So Fred Baker, just me. I think before we can do that, we have to decide what the purpose and intended use for the document is. The original use, I wrote the text.
And tip it down just a bit. Thank you.
The original intended use was essentially 4 years in advance for the advanced team to be able to say, oh gee, they don't have wheelchair access, let's not even think about this city. The IAOC gets into it a year to 2 years later, and then might revisit it at some point. That's a different decision. You know, maybe they've added the wheelchair access, or maybe something's gone away. And that first triage is very different than the decision that the IAOC makes. So I think you need to ask yourself, or we need to ask ourselves, who's using this document and what decision are they making on the basis of it? We can only then decide whether something has to be there at that time.
Alyssa.
Sorry, I'm going to make you stand up again, Alyssa Cooper. So just to be crystal clear, your understanding is that, or you think the good intent of the document is for the purposes of deciding an original booking decision of a specific venue? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So thanks.
Charter-wise, that distinction is not entirely clear. Yeah, well, I will tell you that one of the things we both did in preparation today was read the charter with a fine-tooth comb and try to figure out whether there was something on which to base some of these decisions. So it is clear that this is supposed to be advice from the IETF community to whoever is planning meetings. Here's what we think your criteria, your process should be. That seemed clear to us. But the distinction of who in particular and which place in the process it was to occur is not crystal clear in the charter. So if we need to make that clear in this room, that might be helpful.
In my opinion, you can't figure out what's mandatory until you know that.
Go ahead. The mic is open for a purpose.
Ted Hurdy. It's my impression that in the mandatory category, it's acting like a comb filter. Nothing passes through that filter if it doesn't meet the mandatories, right? And I think Fred's point is that you could have this comb filter at multiple stages of this process. It could be at the very earliest possible stage when the people are going and looking for sites. It could be at much later stage when you're deciding among sites. But I believe, and I may be wrong in this, that if the comb filter is the same, it is actually an optimization to put it as early as possible rather than a requirement.
Thank you. The gears have been cranking in my head because I hadn't thought of this issue before we started, which is always the fun part of being up at the front of the room. But yeah, I don't know that the list can't be used in either place, but probably is better used earlier than later. Alyssa.
Alyssa Cooper. I think just to go back to the point about the charter, I think it's totally fine to do multiple smaller scoped documents or one big one. I think the charter gives flexibility to do either. So if people talk about this and decide that they want to just focus this on one single decision, or they think that we can include criteria that apply to both or different sets of criteria for both, I think we have the flexibility to organize the lists of criteria however people feel comfortable.
My name is Andrew Sullivan. The thing about the mandatory stuff is that, right, this is, I mean, we're thinking of this as sort of procedural guidance about how you get these things, but the actual consequences of this requirement have to do with what's written in contracts. And therefore, in fact, the timing of when those selections happen doesn't matter, because the point at which you have to enforce the thing is when the contract is written. And that is, it might be that you know you have this filter and you do it 4 years in advance or whenever. You could do it anywhere along the line. But the requirement, effectively, is that this be a thing that is in contractual language, so that that is a mandatory thing that has to be in the contract. If it can't be in the contract, then we can't. Then you don't meet the criteria.
So actually, wait. No, I'm gonna hold off for right now.
So, Andrew, for the wheelchair access thing, which is the one that popped into my head first, I think that's exactly right. For the location of stores nearby to buy food, that's not something that's going to appear in a contract. That's a venue decision criteria that is an early filter. And so I think and this is sort of the reason I thought of let's re-examine buckets, because I'm not sure what mandatory means. For different things, it might mean different things. So can you tell me how I deal with criteria that are about venue selection as opposed to contract writing?
This is a point that I made some months ago on the list, that there's a whole lot of stuff in here that is listed as mandatory that just logically speaking cannot possibly be mandatory. It's stuff that you're weighing against one another, and in the plain ordinary meaning of that word, mandatory in English, it's not possibly mandatory. It is may be really, really important to you as opposed to somewhat more important or something like that. But it can't be mandatory. Because you literally, what are you going to do? You're going to have you're going to have all the contract and everything like that, and all of the stores closed because, I don't know, some giant depression happens or something like that. There's nothing you're going to be able to do about that. And in that sense, it can't be a mandatory requirement. If we take that word seriously, then we're abusing it in the draft as it sits.
So, let me mention the more extreme example that popped into my head that's not in the list right now, but I think might fit into the category. If the group decided to include in the document a mandatory requirement that we shall not go to any country which requires women to wear head coverings in public, which of course is something that can change over time. That does seem to me like something that could be characterized as a mandatory requirement if the community decided that they wanted to document such a thing, and yet is subject to the whims of politics and everything else. And again, it's why I'm more and more worried about using the word mandatory and preferring to split into some other sort of buckets if that's going to get us closer to explaining what we mean by these things.
The use of mandatory in the document as it stands says if this thing cannot be achieved, then we walk away. Supposing that we selected a venue in Upper Slobovia, and in between the time where we wrote the contract and the time when we have the meeting, Upper Slobovia was taken over by people who insisted that you wear Lexan headgear, right? Like a glass globe around your head. And a significant portion of our population is claustrophobic, and they can't wear Lexan headgear. I don't know if I can make this any more ridiculous, but anyway, in that case, I would expect our community to say either, we expect that we're going to have, 30% lower attendance at that meeting, and we're going to take that hit, or we would decide to cancel the meeting because the Lexan headgear thing actually turns out to be a symbol of some other kind of thing that we're not willing to sign on for. And that's the decision that we'd have to make. That's the distinction between, is this important and we're going to trade off, or is it mandatory? If it's mandatory, the answer at that point is we cancel the meeting.
And so let me try and reword what you just said in differently and see if you agree. Those kinds of decisions are going to be made case by case anyway when that issue arises, and do not need to be documented specifically, because Lexan headgear in the document is not going to be something we can account for.
You don't have to put Lexan headgear, but there are things in the mandatory list that I think is true. For instance, one of the things in the mandatory list is has adequate rooms, has enough meeting rooms that we can actually have the meeting. Okay, suppose that there is an earthquake and the hotel is damaged and half of the meeting rooms go away. We have to go to another place. It's mandatory. We don't have the choice of saying, oh, well, we'll trade this off and we'll just not have half the meeting. You can't do that, right? So we have to go to another place. We actually had this happen recently, right? The Fairmont in Montreal told us, no, there's not going to be a hotel here at that time, so you can't be in it. Okay, so here we are. We're in this hotel instead. And so you get those kinds of situations, and that's a case where mandatory really means what it says in this document. Other cases are actually, given the definitions we've got, they're actually important. That is, we're going to make decisions, and people don't like to say, oh yes, we're going to trade that off. The Lexan headgear thing, we're going to trade that thing off, and we're going to maybe take a 30% hit on attendance at the meeting, and that's too bad. Those people aren't going to come. But we have to be serious about the meaning of these things. That many of these things we are in fact going to trade off, and some of them are human rights or so on. And it makes me deeply uncomfortable to admit that, but it's true.
I just want to do a little line jump because Barry's jabber channeling, are you? No. Okay, then line in order. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I guess I missed the earthquake in Montreal, but I actually do agree with Andrew that we have too many items that are marked as mandatory. That is worthwhile fixing. I think the general point though is that we were talking about this, at the point of signing the contract, but we really are setting requirements or expectations to multiple parties, like the nature for don't have an earthquake and the city should still exist and be above water and such. But also the country that the laws don't change suddenly and implement travel bans or whatever. And so it's not just the contract with the hotel that matters. But we do have to look at the really crucial, absolutely mandatory requirements like that we still have meeting rooms. And those may have to be looked at several points. Fred is absolutely right that we have to look at this as the first triage point, but also later when we actually make a decision to sign a contract, and maybe also later if things change. That's fine, but I'm not actually sure if that fundamentally changes the way that we write these requirements, because we still need the meeting rooms whether we're doing the initial triage or signing the contract, or the final check 1 month before.
This is Barry Leba. I agree with the last thing Yari said in particular. What I got up to say was that I don't think it matters so much where in the process we're talking about. I think this is intended to be applied at each step in the process. When we're thinking, well, maybe we ought to go to Slabovia, we need to look at what we know about Slabovia at that point with respect to these things. And what hotels are available, we may know, and what meeting rooms are available, we may know, but what supermarkets are available, we may not at that point. When a site visit is done to check it out, then we know more information and we apply it again, and we keep applying it. And I think one thing that Andrew did bring out, despite the silliness of the headgear, is that once we get to the point where we've signed a contract, and we're locked into something, well, we're never locked in, we can always do something, I think things change. There are some things that were mandatory up to that point that we won't cancel because of once we are financially committed. And there are other things where we have to. And we need to think about that distinction.
And so we are going to cut the line at this point. We'll let go ahead with your comments, and then we'll figure out next steps.
Ted Hardy, first I caught a bug in the code on the back of Yari's sweatshirt. So Yari, you should see me after for a patch. If at all possible, I'd like to do it as a real patch, because I think I have some sewing gear upstairs, and that would be amusing. I think a different way to put what Barry just said may make it a little bit easier to process. And I think it reads on what Andrew was saying, because if you're thinking about this in terms of a comb filter, and you apply a comb filter at a very early stage, or you apply a comb filter at a later stage, you don't expect signal to pass through the filter at either of those two stages, and it acts as you expect. If there is a change in signal after that point, the comb filter cannot reach it, right? And so many of these kind of large scale, there was an earthquake, the lower Slabovia was taken over by the Lexan Corporation. Things turn out to be a late change in signal rather than a change in the filter. And I believe that if you say this is the point at which this filter is applied, and it can be iterative, as Barry suggests, and anything that changes the circumstances after this is handled by process X, which may not be passing it back through that comb filter at the last minute. I think you end up in a state where you say, hey, this is what we do, and this is the set of criteria which must be done by contract time, and you can apply the filter as early as you care to, but you recheck it at contract time to make sure it's true. Anything that happens after contract time, you have an exception process to deal with. And some of those exception processes, had there been an earthquake in Japan before Yokohama, it might have been canceled immediately, right? Because there might not have been time, depending on when the earthquake occurred. But I think we have to be pretty careful to say that here's the point at which it must be applied, and anything earlier than that is a useful optimization. But after that, we need to be able to say in the document, an exception process occurs if this changes post this application.
So I am hearing so far, I think, that independent of what's in the criteria list, we probably need to express this kind of guidance somewhere in a paragraph, in maybe a couple of paragraphs in the document, of these are expected to be applied at different times, different places. Basically describe the kinds of things that you and Andrew are talking about beyond having the actual criteria list. Elliot, if it's a how do I edit this document question, please step in.
Yeah, so what I think I'm hearing is, and maybe I'm wrong, and I apologize if this is the line or whatever. What I think I'm hearing is that there are criteria that will occur at various points in the process, that we have to be explicit in the document as to, like, if we want something that should be immutable throughout the process, we should say that. If we want something that should be used as home filter before the process, we can say that. So up to the point of the signing of the contract, this is what we expect the IOC to look at. Past the point of the contract, this is what is mandatory and this is what is not. This is what I'm hearing.
I expect folks to waive incessantly if that's not the case.
Alyssa Cooper. So maybe just a friendly amendment in terms of how we make progress on this is, because I will say the preface to this is that I think considering all of the potential scenarios after the contract is signed is going to quickly get very complicated, and this task is already very fraught and complicated. So I wonder if just considering the set of criteria that we can get consensus around for the initial booking of a venue would be a good step to see if we can achieve that, and then go back and say, okay, do we want to think about other points in the process and guidance and so on? Because, I mean, there are for sure also items that will come up in the after signing phase that aren't relevant at all in the pre-signing phase, like the cancellation fee, right? There is no cancellation fee before you've signed. So they're definitely not going to be exactly the same criteria. And the task is hard enough. So let's break it down maybe and just do the first task first. But just my suggestion again.
Thank you.
I think this also necessitates a slight change of wording to what is listed under mandatory as to when we walk away. And I'll come up with proposed text on the list for that.
Thank you.
I don't think it's a major change, but it,
Tobias.
Tobias Gonram. I'd like to echo something that was said before. The number of mandatory elements should really be absolutely minimal. And in fact, I think we are chasing a little Mike, not close enough. Okay, sorry, closer. And I think we are chasing like a red herring, I think you would say in English, because the truly mandatory things are usually something that is quite common sense recognizable if you know it. So the main challenge might be maybe you're not aware of it, but it's quite recognizable. What's much more difficult to judge on is the things between. So between super, super important, very important, important, a little bit important. So this is something I believe where there's more value in guidance. Yeah. And if you make a lot of things mandatory, you may decrease the search space so much that there might not be anything left.
Appreciate that.
Okay, so kind of two things that kind of jumped out at me as a result of this conversation, and it has to do with coming in, looking at the charter, looking at the document after not having participated actually deeply in this for a long time. A couple assumptions that I made that wanted to clear with the group and make sure we're on the same page here. One is when all the guidance that we have in the document applies, and we've talked about that a bit. It could be only at the beginning. It could be throughout the process. It seemed like everyone was looking for it to apply throughout the process, although perhaps it could change a little bit in time, right? So that was one thing. The other thing was, in the charter, it says we want to come up with a process that we are comfortable with. And so that really, and guidance that we're comfortable with, that leaves a lot of discretion in the hands of this group, I think, based on what we come up with. And the process could be very prescriptive, even where we have mandatories that go into contract, or it could be much more of like a guidance, things to consider when you're initially choosing potential venues and cities. I had always viewed this as being more on the kind of guidance and not really contractual type things. I think those are two important things. Once we kind of get past those, then I think the rest of this starts to fall out a bit more neatly.
So I think we've got good next steps. I think Elliot's heard sort of the overarching, and we'll come up with some text, and we'll go from there. And this seems broader structural, and like it may end up being paragraphs of introduction to how these things are applied, and maybe some note next to each criteria, but we'll give it a shot. This has been incredibly helpful, and as usual, completely unexpected from what I thought it might be. All right, so now we're going to go on to the more straightforward issues list. And again, remember, these are the things we've caught in our first pass. We expect more will pop up on the list. Elliot, the floor is yours.
I'm not going to stand in the pink zone. I apologize.
Well, the camera might end up tilting down and looking right at you anyway, so.
Yeah, okay. So, hi. So what I would like to do is direct your attention to the GitHub list. If somebody wouldn't mind just putting that into like the chat room so people can follow too, but I see it's also on the screen. All right, yeah, so there are currently 18 issues that are open. I might have missed a couple, in which case you should send something to the list saying, Elliot, you missed one. And here's what I would like to open. What I will do is I'm going to go through starting at, I think we just discussed really issue number 1, which is what does it mean, you know, mandatory, important. That's what Pete just covered with you in great detail. These issues are broken out from a couple of different email messages. So Andrew, it's good that you're in the room, assuming you're still in the room, because there are a good number of them are from you, a couple of them from Yari, and a couple of them from other people. So starting with issue number 2, what Andrew has asked for is a
timing of the 3-month check. Was that just, what are you talking about? Issue?
I'm sorry?
When you say issue number 2, I want to make sure I bring up the right one.
It's need a real decision tree. So if you click on sort, you know, it sorts by, you can sort by earliest, later. It's off on the right, I think. No, it's, yeah, go over to the right. All the way over to the right. Where you see sort, just take oldest first.
You want oldest, okay.
Right. Right, so need a real decision tree. Okay. So this text should look eerily familiar. This is text that, this is a message that Andrew had posted, a part of a message that Andrew had posted. This is part of his review. Essentially what he's proposing is that there be an actual decision tree for the IOC meeting committee to follow, and the IOC to follow, and you have, in his example, at the bottom of the issue list, at the bottom of the text is you have mandatory, and then you have essentially a nice big and list of all the mandatory issues. Then you have a secondary list of important and then a tertiary list of desired. And so his proposal essentially is, this is the decision tree rule form that the IOC would follow. I think this is, so editorially, I don't think this is hard to add into the text to say in the beginning, either in the beginning or somewhere else in the text, here is how these rules will be applied. I can do it one of two ways, assuming people want this, which is to say very clearly that the IOC shall first evaluate the mandatories, and if any of these fail, then the venue will not be selected, for instance. And then it is to consider the important ones and evaluate each of the important ones and choose amongst those which they can. It's not as quite as firm as the mandatory, right? And then repeat the process for desired. This is easy enough text to add. I just want to know that the working group would like it added or not. Or if nobody cares, first of all, does anybody support Andrew's view on this?
A hand went up in the tree.
I'm okay with having it. I don't think it's required, but I'm okay with it.
Okay.
Putting it another way, does anybody object to the approach? Okay.
Bob, you had a comment?
Sorry.
Hi, Bob Hinden. I'm not sure I'm objecting, but I guess the part that makes me a little nervous is sort of, I like the idea of communicating to the IOC what we think is important in venues. Trying to say how exactly the IOC should do that starts to make me nervous, and this seems like maybe a little more in that direction. What was this called again? Decision tree, right? That seems like more of trying to write code for how the IOC should work as opposed to saying what the requirements are. So this makes, I'm not saying no, I'm just saying this makes me a little nervous. Getting too you have to do it exactly this way. There might be reasons to do it differently.
Yeah, Tobias Gondrom, I would echo that. I think setting priorities and goals makes sense. Trying to write an automaton that shall produce the result without human interaction is, I think, missing the point. This is a much too fuzzy world. So if you try to capture everything, you basically fail. And there is a reason why we have human beings who analyze this for us, and we should use them.
Ted Hardy, my take on this is that for certain of these things, making it as mechanical as possible is actually assists the people who have to do this work, because it means that they can do some of it very, very fast. There are definitely parts of this where having humans do the evaluation is critical, but for some of this, a mushy comb filter doesn't help you at all. The signal just passes through, possibly distorted. And so I do actually believe that if there are things that we can treat as comb filter items, being clear that that's what they are is helpful to the people making the decisions rather than taking away their agency.
I just want to say, Ted, that image of a mushy comb is going to be with me for a while.
And so, and let me make one comment here, Elliot. Given what Ted just said, it may be that some of the text you end up writing for the first big issue solves some of this problem, because you're going to be describing how the filters get used and whether the particular mechanism may fall out of that anyway.
Yes, and I just want to also add that I suspect that the next issue is going to impact this one. which is Andrew's issue that there are too many mandatories. So in as much as there are few mandatories, it makes it, I think, a lot easier for this to be, far more automatic and may address the problems that Bob and presumably, Tobias and presumably Ole are about to say.
Ole Jacobson. Work?
It's kind of quiet, but yeah, just speak up.
Okay. One thing I think is, and maybe you covered this already, I was a few minutes late, but one thing that's important to state up front is that there is more than one document here. And so the specifications for the venue are actually in the hands of the Secretariat, and depends on the number of working groups and the expected number of attendees and all that sort of stuff, which varies from meeting to meeting. Certainly varies over time, and putting a dollar figure in what the hotel should cost is also ridiculous in this document. There's another very important document called the Network Requirements document, which very specifically is in place for obviously the technical reasons, but also for political reasons. You can't have someone stand up and say, we don't do any filtering here, but you might have someone be able to stand up and say, we comply with the network requirements document. So there, and I'm sure we could devise several more component documents like that have their sort of own life.
Alyssa Cooper, I think I had read the meaning of this message from Andrew a little differently than you characterized it, Elliot. I thought this was more of a sort of style comment about how the document can be comprehended, insofar as if we have a category of items that are designed to be traded off against each other, or it is acknowledged that they may be traded off against each other, it's easier to read this document and understand it if they're all grouped together in the document, which is a different thing from saying that group of things must be considered only afterward in time after some other group of things, which is more like prescribing the process that the IOC has to use. And I agree with the people who said that the prescriptiveness about the process doesn't really seem necessary, but I agree with the notion of of grouping the items to be traded off against each other together in the document.
Okay, so to Alyssa's point, the document is currently organized in, I think, 3, if memory serves, groups of requirements. I think it's something like, overall city-based venue or regional venue, a hotel, and there's one more group which is not standing in my head at the moment. And it is perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine proposal for me to reorganize the requirements in such that they're not grouped in that way, but rather grouped in the way that you were saying, where we have the mandatory requirements first. We have mandatory requirements first, then important, then desired. If that's what people want, I'm happy to regroup in that way. Is that what people want?
The other possibility, just so you keep it in mind, is you can add some criteria note on the side that is the alternative grouping, right? This is one of the type 1, type 2, type 3.
Right. I mean,
so whichever, that's an editorial thing, but it doesn't need to change the entire order of the document if you don't want.
Well, I think if we are grouping based on, if we are simply ordering in sort of stack, ranking them, if you will, then we have to indicate the nature of the requirement, at least for clarity purposes. But beyond that, I don't think we have to go too much further. But the reason that things are grouped as they are is that they are already logically grouped in one way. It's perfectly fine to logically group them in the other way. And I'm happy to do whichever the group wants. So if you prefer I personally prefer the mandatory, the group, grouping in terms of what's most important first. But that's Elliot's view, not the, not the working group's view. And so whatever the working group wants, I'm happy to do.
Can I suggest that this is probably not generating a lot of energy in the room, okay, and probably can be worked out on the list?
All right.
At least as far as the ordering question, which is editorial. So right, why don't we post that to the list?
So but to close, I'll just say I'll be looking for guidance on the list as to what people want. And so now we are up to the next item, which is directly related, which is the too much mandatory comments. Now here, What Andrew has said, Andrew already explained in some detail, I think, why he thinks, some things aren't really mandatory in his comments here. What we could do is to really just go through the list of mandatory requirements and say, well, are these really mandatory? Can we hold a meeting? And if these requirements aren't met, and we could step down and looking through the list in the eyes of somebody who has the pen before they sign the contract, which I think is the guidance that Alyssa gave us in order to keep it simple. That's what I propose to do unless there is an objection.
Not an objection, but a, let's say, friendly amendment, Tobias Gondrom. Actually, we shouldn't need to argue that something is not mandatory. You should need to argue that something is mandatory. So like by default, everything should not be mandatory, and you should have to make a very strong case that it is. And that should be the path for deciding. So like anything that I see there should be considered as non-mandatory until someone really makes a strong case that it needs to be.
So Warren Kumari, kind of following up from that. So I'm part of the IETF NOC team. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing when we're building the network is just sitting around discussing where we can have the next meeting. And there are a bunch of people in that who go around to all the venues and have a look. And it's really hard to actually find venues that are perfect for us. So I think we should be really, really careful to make sure that not too much stuff is mandatory, or we might not be able to have a meeting at all.
Okay, so if people are comfortable with that approach, chairs, are you comfortable with that approach?
So let me first restate it to make sure I capture it correctly. So the overall path that you would take with this would be to revisit the mandatories, and with an eye to reduce the number of mandatories, and where they continue to exist, make sure that they are very worded very clearly, so as you can tell when you're on one side of meeting the mandatory versus not.
I think that actually Tobias said it really well, right? Which is people should have to argue that something is mandatory, and they should have to place a forceful argument. I think that's a compelling argument. I think we've heard that throughout the room. So that's what I would propose to do, is just go through and at least take an initial cut today if we can. And say, are these things, let's spot the mandatories and have people stand up and say, is this really mandatory?
To frame this, again, just as maybe the communication was not clear, per default, actually I would take all of them out and put them into important, and then we can start the discussion whether it's really necessary, and it needs to be an overwhelming clarity that this is really mandatory, not just some person saying. And I mean, this goes very much towards what Warren said before. If you don't do that, this will be a very difficult position. So put them all in important, and then let's start argue which one individually must be mandatory. And the default in all decisions should be important, not mandatory.
So if that's the case, and actually I like that too, then what we can do, we don't have to spend the entire time in this room on it. What we can do is we can say they're all, I will relabel them as the editor as all important, but then it's incumbent on this group actually to make sure that everybody's reading the document to make sure we don't actually miss a mandatory that should be mandatory, right? So people should make the argument when it's appropriate. Is that what the room wants? Is that what the chairs want?
Ted Hardy, I'm willing to go along with that, but I believe that it's going to set the working group process back a bit, because we're going to go back into relitigating. And I think that the critical thing really is step one, redefining what mandatory is in very clear terms. And I would be happy to use editor's discretion to then look at them and say, as a first pass, whether it really meets the mandatory bar that has been set. But if the editor's discretion is to start by saying, I don't think any of them are, and I'll accept PR's change that back to mandatory after an issue has been raised to make an appropriate argument about why it is, then I think that's okay. But I think that that the reality is there are some of these things which really are above the bar of important, and we need to be very careful in resetting the bar, that we acknowledge that this is a temporary thing, because we really will move things back above it. And the way my colleague Tobias phrased that, I don't believe was quite as clear on that point as I would personally like.
So I also think, Ted, don't go away for a moment, because I think the first thing you said, I think, was really important. And I want you to just comment just a bit more on it, which is what we think mandatory means, right? Do we have absolute clarity on what mandatory means? Because everything falls from that.
I believe that the point that was made earlier was that at the moment at which the criterion is applied, if a mandatory condition is not met, the process stops considering the venue or locale for which the failure occurred.
Right. What I'm talking about is the criteria for a line here to actually be mandatory. What does it mean? So when should something be mandatory? We should be clear on that in our heads, I think.
Okay, so I think that's a very different question than the one I was trying to get us to clarity on, because I think that the critical thing that I think we really need to be clear on is if something is a mandatory requirement and is not met, we are clear that at that point, at whatever point that occurs in the acceptable process, and that may stop at contract signing and move into exception processing, that venue moves off the table, that locale moves off the table, whatever the scope is of the issue. The Lexan hats are not acceptable. Therefore, we don't even go and do the site visit. The Lexan hats are not acceptable. Therefore, we don't sign the contract, etc. But I think that the question of whether something is above or below the bar is a very different question that we need to tackle in the context of the particular requirements, rather than trying to make a single bar that each one of them would meet.
So just a comment on that, because what I think I've heard is that there actually is a definition in the document as to what mandatory is. The problem is that we have too many, perhaps, mandatories right now, and that the wording of those mandatories is too vague for them to really be considered mandatory. So it's not so much the definition of mandatory, it's how we then go and apply that in the document.
Yeah, I think we're within epsilon of what happens when a mandatory requirement isn't met in terms of the definition in the document. It's really just that the admission criteria to the class that I think we do not have a common view on is my understanding.
Brian Carpenter. That is exactly why I'm standing here. The current text says mandatory, and this is the definitions basically. Mandatory. If this requirement cannot be met, a location under consideration is unacceptable. I think that definition is actually wrong. I think what it means is if in the judgment of the IAOC, this requirement cannot be met, a location under consideration is unacceptable. Because, you know, the IETF decided 10 years ago to delegate all this administrative nonsense to the administrative thing. And you can't both delegate it and impose mandatory constraints on their decision-taking. So I think what is missing is it should say, if in the judgment of the IEOC, the condition is...
Okay, wait.
And that gets you out of this particular question, because it tells you who decides what's mandatory.
I see a small pinhole that is about to turn into a large rat hole.
I could see why you say that, but, you know, I think it's important.
But let me go back to a discussion that was had earlier, which is going through the exercise of describing how criteria will be applied, which is what that initial discussion we had was all about, I think will very much clarify the definition of mandatory in a way that will address this problem. So I do not think we need to, at this point, go through a redefining mandatory or defining it correctly if Elliot first goes through the process of solving issue number 1, and then we revisit to see if we have to dig any deeper. I am hopeful that we will not. Tobias.
Yes, Tobias Gondrom. Maybe to the when this is applied point. I think there are 4 times when this question arises. First one, when the site visit happens, like first selection. Second one, meetings committee makes a recommendation. Third one, IEOC makes the decision. And fourth one is after we sign the contract. And like then we have potential penalties that apply, and we are in a slightly different position towards enforcing what we want. So this might be maybe helpful information for you.
Yeah, I have that down as the first thing we talked about,
Yeah,
and we'll
perfect.
cover that.
And I apologize for repeating what has already been said.
It's no problem.
Some of the mandatories, I shouldn't say that, some of the requirements there are clear, like, oh, no war zone. Okay, I think that's quite a binary decision, and I'm fine with that. Things like, venue is okay, that's really very subjective, and you need to have someone make that question. Like, if you take a look at this list, and I think really most of that's gray, you need to move out of mandatory. Like war zone, that I think is something easier to distinguish.
Leslie Daigle. A couple of points that might be slightly at the wrong point in the agenda, but they are kind of cross-cutting. One, I'm entirely sympathetic to the points about being careful about what you call mandatory and how you describe the specific criterion. But I'm also thinking ahead beyond the points that Tobias outlined, the 4 points at which these might be applicable. Sometimes, to elaborate on the 4th point, sometimes conditions change, right? So the IOC is going to need to know at what point, if a condition changes in the mandatory category, at what point are they expected to, scram everything, run up the bills to hundreds of thousands of dollars and move a location because some condition has changed. Today, that's basically done with discretion, the IOC's delegated discretion, and maybe that's the way it has to be going forward. But I would use that as a case study for looking at whether you think things are mandatory or how you define what the mandatory condition is. It's not just, we'll stop the site visit. It's are we going to have the implicit expectation that this is applicable at all points up until we actually meet at a given venue? Certainly take Ted's point that this is about documenting the community's expectations of the community's meetings such that the IOC and the meetings committee can meet community expectations going forward. At least that's how I look at it. I think it is delicate work. Think about it along the entire timeline, and then a specific proposal. When this is done to the working group's acceptance and adopted to some level, can I suggest that we consider a period of implementation as a test and then revisit, so that if we find that there are some things that are actually pretty impossible to implement pragmatically, we can revisit it in the document. And I mention that now, not just to mention at the wrong point in the agenda, but hopefully also to help relieve some of the pressure on how well we capture some of the terminology here, because some of the challenges here are about trying to imagine all possible future realities.
So I think there are 2 things there. The first is how this applies throughout the entire process. And going back to, I think what we hopefully agreed earlier was that we're applying the based on the guidance we got, we'll apply this up to the point of contract signing in terms of, what mandatory means. And then it seems to me what I heard was that beyond that, the implication was that it's to the discretion of the IOC.
No, so thanks for letting me try to be just a little bit clearer. I think that the terminology that is developed for that point up to the contract signing is going to be naturally setting expectations, or at least framing expectations for what happens afterwards. So, so keep that in mind when you're writing stuff that's mandatory for up to signing the contract.
Excellent. I know who to go to consult on the wording.
Franca Akamai. I think that the definition of mandatory could be better operationalized, and the discussion could be better focused by stating that the IETF will hold a meeting at all if and only if a venue can be located which satisfies all mandatory criteria.
So personally, I like Ted's description better, but I mean, this is wordsmithing. I just wanted to give one illustration for you about this after the contract has been signed. So normally, changing something after the contract has been signed requires first that you find an alternative, and second, that there is a financial impairment coming with it. It may very well be that, let's say, $100,000 extra may be something that the community is willing to pay to avoid certain problems. So I want to strengthen what Leslie said, like, if you state something, or if we state something as mandatory, we will consider this as a key point if it later changes. And even if it costs us money, we may have to, so we will use this as a guidance, I think.
Alyssa Cooper, one other item to consider as people are thinking about the definition of mandatory is, however it is defined, if there will then be subjective criteria that are listed as mandatory. I think that's one of the difficulties of understanding the current list of mandatory criteria, is that they're almost all subjective. So it's hard to understand what they mean.
So Warren Kamari, with the mandatory stuff, I think that we also still need to keep in mind that for many of them, there needs to be an exception process, right? A good example recently was, we're not going to go somewhere where there's a war zone. We're recently in South Korea. It's really, really close to what is technically a war zone, right? The DMZ is still classified as that. So it's really easy to make hard, fast rules which don't account for all possible side effects. So even if it's something mandatory, hopefully there's still a, obviously this isn't really what was meant, even though what it said, so exception process here.
Okay, I think that's a good point, Warren. And I think there's actually something in there already about that. The exception process meaning being that the IOC is intended to go to the community. I want to just pick up one point that I see a little bit of a conflict between what I thought we had said in the room and what Tobias just said from an IOC perspective. And I want to see if I can resolve that just a little bit, which is, what happens after the contract is signed? Is mandatory always, or is mandatory up to the point that the contract is signed? And I think we have to be absolutely clear as to, the scope of this work. I had heard, what I thought I had heard earlier was that the scope of the work would be that mandatory, really means mandatory up until the contract is signed. And then we have to allow that things are going to change. It may cost us a lot of money. And the reason that this is important to resolve is we can go either way, right? As your editor, I'm happy to go either way on this. But
let Tobias clarify.
Okay.
Tobias Conrom. Just speaking for myself, okay? I'm on the IOC, but I'm only speaking for myself. So if we list things as mandatory, of course, up to the contract point, all is good. I think we are relatively clear. Afterwards, if we, for example, see that the situation changes, I think it will be a strong motivator for the IOC to look at this. Oh, suddenly the situation has changed, so we now need to at least look at this again. In a number of cases, a change can be very expensive or impossible because there's no alternative. If there's no other venue, then we can cancel. That's another change. In other cases, actually, a change might be relatively cheap. Let's say $50,000. And I think that's an exception process. So it's like, but I think this mandatory point would trigger that exception process. Like, oh, we see, oh, something is mandatory, it's no longer fulfilled, maybe we need to revisit and reconsider. At least that is how I have seen these things in the past.
Okay, so I think then what we're talking about, Tobias, is that the exception process might be a little different before and after signing, is what I'm hearing, right? And maybe I need to document that, where before, before you sign, you consult the community.
Before you sign, this is not an exception. Before you sign, you will consider the mandatory requirement and you will not sign it.
Okay.
It's that simple.
All right.
After you signed it, obviously you kind of, the train has left the station and then you have an exception and then you need to be a little bit flexible with how the world works.
Okay. I can run with that.
This is Barry Leva. I completely agree with the last thing Tobias said. And so what I would say is that we should perhaps have something in the document that makes it clear that once we have a binding contract, if a mandatory item changes, the IAOC uses its discretion in how to handle the situation, and that discretion may include consulting the community.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So I guess I'm also agreeing with the last statements, but I really can here point out that it kind of sounds like we're room full of engineers because we're creating an algorithm, and I can't actually think of any case where we would have an issue with a mandatory requirement and not end up having a community discussion about it.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly have done that in the past, I think.
Okay. So I think coming back to this issue then, what I think I'm doing, to address Ted's point, I think I'm doing a scrub of all of the requirements, and by default they land back into the important category. But if I might myself put out the PR, if it's very clear already that something is incontrovertibly mandatory, that I will put out the PR myself and say, here, this one seems to me to need to remain mandatory, and the rest are for people to argue that they are in fact mandatory. Is that acceptable to people? Goodbye.
Sorry, one last addition, Tobias. If you do that, maybe see that when these are gray areas or like quantifiable, not strict yes, no, try to make it as restrictive as possible in your decision. Like if it comes to money terms or shops or something around it, like really drive it as low as you can from a what is mandatory, and be specific. Like if
as few mandatory or as limited, the requirement is as constrained as possible.
Yes.
So
yes.
that
thank you. That is
its applicability is
as constrained as possible, as small as possible is the mandatory space, and it needs to be clear, like not this like fluffy somewhere here.
Okay.
Barry Leva again. The trouble with that is some of the things that are currently listed as mandatory, for instance, that the venue be reasonably safe, is difficult to constrain. You can't put numbers on that. And it is subject to change. There may suddenly be some terrorist activity in the area, and we have to consider what, how that change has affected us. You can't put numbers on it.
Yeah, and that's the reason why it should be important. If you can't qualify it, and if you require some committee to treat it as mandatory, how can a committee do that if you can't tell them what it is? So that's why it is important. It is super, super important. No question about it.
I will go back to my earlier claim that I think before you attempt to deal with this issue, I think the list will need to see text describing how these things are used and what their purpose is, because that may end you up very quickly deciding how to categorize any given criteria.
Okay.
Andrew, did you have a final comment?
Andrew Sullivan. Yeah. So this was part of the reason that this thing that you're looking at was part of a longer message, which also suggested a sort of decision tree thing. And
let me stop you, Andrew. We covered that one too.
So I understand that, but what I'm trying to say instead is that's the reason that these were put together in a single message, because it seems to me that if you want to do what Pete just said, then you can use that sort of pass in order to give you the narrowing of the categories.
Okay.
All right. I think you've got enough clarity on the order of things to do, and I think some of the answers may pop out later.
Okay. This now, we'll go back then on to issue number 4, which is process innovation. And this had to do with consensus. Andrew, do you want to just talk to this for a few moments since you're in the room? In terms of, IETF consensus and the text that applies here.
So the reason I was concerned about this particular text is because there's a lot of discussion in the document about something being acceptable, and then we had this discussion about, and then there's this bit about consensus, and I'm trying to understand how you operationalize acceptability. The only piece of the document that seems to tell me that is this consensus thing. There's no way that we can run consensus calls on venue selections, right? Because it's just not going to work. And also, you can't actually ask people until you've signed the contract, because the details of the contract and the other party is confidential until such time as you can announce it, because otherwise you're not in a position to negotiate. So it's not just oh, this would be nice. This is a pure practical problem that you can't do consensus on this. And that's the reason that I'm deeply worried about this, that we either need to come up with a different operationalization of acceptable, or else we need to, take the consensus stuff out of there, despite the fact that obviously consensus is the way you do things and not surveys. It seems to me that either this, I guess that's really what the problem is. Either this language is trivially true or it's false. And I don't think we should have trivially true things in the document, and I also don't think we should have false things.
Okay, so your proposal, it seems like your preferred proposal is that this text be simply removed, and alternatively that the text below be inserted. Is that my understanding? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So the text that I suggested, I was trying to say, well, maybe this is what it means. But if that's what it means, then I don't think it. Then I think it's back to trivially true, and it isn't really necessary.
All right. So the proposal is to remove the text that reads IETF consensus with respect to this meeting venue, and goes all the way down to consensus. I'll just stand up and show. To remove this text here, does anybody object to that?
And just to clarify, you're removing it and not replacing it with anything.
Removing
Just removing it.
Okay. I see or hear no objections, so that's what I plan to do.
All right, and I just want to do a quick time and agenda check. So what I think we might do is do an issue or two more for you, Elliot, have Suresh come in, do the questions he's got open on his document, and then we can continue back on your list for as long as people can survive. But I figure let's keep Suresh within close to the scheduled hour and a half, and then we can use the overtime for more of your issues if we can. That work?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Why don't we do an issue more, and then I am Suresh that now is the time.
Okay, so now the next one is also from Andrew's review. Yeah, Andrew, I split up your message into multiple things so that people. This is the issue here was the definition in Section 3 of hotels might or might not be part of the facility. So that I think you're seeking slight clarification as to the applicability of the IETF network or something like that. Let's just, if I bring up the text, I'm just going to do this. In the meantime, Andrew, if you want to just clarify exactly what you want, what you're proposing.
This is Andrew Sullivan. So the reason I didn't propose text here was because I didn't know what the thing meant. So the idea here, when I wrote this, I went through it as though I were, suppose that I were on the IOC, which I was at the time, and I needed to make a decision based on a recommendation that came to the IOC. How would I apply this thing to that? And this definition seemed to me to be problematic because I couldn't tell whether hotel rooms were in the facility or not. And it seemed to me that there was a facility thing, there was IETF hotel and headquarters hotel, and I still didn't know what this meant for the facility or whether there was a thing about the networks and how they had to go together or something. So it seemed to me that there was a definitional gap here where we needed some kind of thing that covered, the meeting facilities and the hotel that is sort of associated with it and everything, and there was like a covering word for all of that. And I think facility was both supposed to be and not supposed to be that, and that's why I had a problem here.
Okay, so to be clear, let me just read through, I'm going to read the definition so everybody has them. So what it says, the definition of facility is, these contain meeting rooms and associated resources and possibly also contain hotel rooms. And then right below that, IETF hotels. One or more hotels in close proximity to the facility where the IETF guest room allocations are negotiated and IETF SIDs are in use. So these are the two things. And your point, okay, and then the next one, the headquarters hotels, the hotel designated as primary for the IETF meeting. It includes IETF SIDs for networking, might be adjoining or even contain the meeting facility, and typically has the bulk of the hotel room allocations. So,
and so this is Barry. I think what's meant here is that the facility is where the meeting rooms are. The headquarters hotel is where the primary hotel where the hotel rooms are, and the facility and the headquarters hotel might be together, might be in the same place, in which case the facility contains hotel rooms and the headquarters hotel contains the facility. I think that's what's meant.
Is that clear to you, Andrew?
This is Andrew again. So yes, I understand that is one of the that is a meaningful interpretation. But it seems to me that what we really have here are three things, right? We have the facility, which has the meeting rooms in it. We have the headquarters hotel, and then we need a term that covers the meeting facility plus the headquarters hotel and put them together, because sometimes they're separate and sometimes they aren't. And what I don't want to do is set up the definition such that actually you have to have an argument about what the definition is every time when you want to have those things separate or something like that. And that's the reason that I had a hard problem with this definition.
Okay. What I propose to do is to work with you offline to come up with a proposal for the definitions and then to straighten out the definitions, and I'll bring that to the list. Okay?
All right, so I think now is a good point to break off for a moment. Let's do Suresh's document, and then we will come back and do more of this. Especially since Suresh has now walked into the room, which makes it easier to work on his document. And Charles has slides, which he will get in a moment. Well, Charles has slide and one or two, pretty things on either end of the slide.
So I'm really glad, this is the less controversial document in the group. So I was following this on Medeco, and so this is the high-level policy for the meetings, and this just got adopted between the last meeting cycle and this as a working group document. So there's some minor changes that I made. I think it was Brian who said wildcard is kind of got a negative connotation, and so went ahead and changed everything to exploratory meetings. and added like 2 more like RIRs that were not listed because clearly an oversight on my part, and I added those 2 into the document. And that leaves us with like 3 kind of like simmering questions like that need to get answered before we like ship off the document. And they have been like fairly controversial, and I don't think they should be, but they are. Okay. So one of the things that when we started talking about it, people said like, oh, why do we go to new places? Like, and people said, hey, we want to attract new participants like from those places, and that's why we go there. And this has been always kind of like a red herring, right? Because we never measured how like, it like the uptake from these new regions happens, and it's not even clear that we intended to do that. Like, and so my suggestion is like, we didn't intend to do this, so we should take it out of the document. But if I would like to hear the working group's opinion on whether we should keep such kind of text in the document or not. Okay, Tobias?
One question. Are you asking about the question, whether we should remove it at all, or are you asking for the answer?
So are we meeting in new places to attract new participants?
That is not the only criteria. That is not the only
reason. Is it even a goal? Is it a reason or not?
I can't speak to that. That's for the IETF community to speak to. What I can say is that other reasons are to spread the pain of going to different regions or different locations.
Right, that's already in the document, and that's not controversial. So like putting the travel pain and the time zone pain is already in the document, so it's not like something we are disputing, right? But is this something we want to state as a goal or not, like for doing this policy? Go ahead.
Hi there, Glenn Dean from Comcast NBC Universal. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Glenn Dean, Comcast NBC Universal. There's another reason we meet in new places, and that is that if we go to the same place over and over again, we will exhaust the sponsors because they will be hitting the same sponsor over and over again. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. So which text are we removing?
Do we want text? There's no text.
Do we want text in there that says we meet in different venues to attract new participants? That's the only question here.
Will that include removing the assertion though that we meet in new places? Okay.
Brian Carpenter, on the question you asked, I don't think we should say this at all. I think it comes under the somewhat wishy-washy name of outreach, and that's not an IETF goal. That's an Internet Society goal, and it's very fine if they do things that encourage new participants. But I don't think it's specifically our goal.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. And that was kind of my suggestion, right? So I didn't want to do it, but I just want to run it by the working group to make sure that happens. And one of the kind of escape valves we have is like, let's say we decide to do this in the future. That could be one of the reasons somebody gives for an exploratory meeting, saying like, hey, like we want to attract people from this community and we want to do this. And that would be like written down as a reason for having that meeting, one of the like stars meetings, okay? And okay, so I will pull this out of the document. So close this issue and put it out of the document. Like, so right now it's in like the open issues pieces, so it's just gonna go. And the second thing is how we define the region. So we've been like waffling in on this, okay? And I haven't seen like clear consensus in one direction or another. So there's like 2 major things that are suggested. One of them is like use like UN statistical stuff for like macro geographical regions, or use RIRs. So the RIR thing is like pretty specific, and the UN thing is a bit more fuzzy, but like there's like clear definition that separates some of these things, because the UN uses Americas as like a region. Okay, that includes North America, South America, like Caribbean, and so on. And then it splits out Oceania into a separate region, which is not Asia. So if you go on the RIR path, you have APNIC that pulls in like Brian and like other people from Australia and so on, right, into the same like division. On this side, like we're gonna have like LACNIC and AFRINIC like also getting separated. So most of them, so it's like LACNIC getting separated and Oceania getting included. Like that's pretty much the compromise like we are looking at.
Ted?
Ted Hardy, I understand that this is a very difficult problem, and I don't want to minimize it, but I believe that both of these are kind of missing the point made in another part of the document about transportation cost and pain, right? And in effect, what we really are looking at from a regional perspective is regions for which we consider you this, the same in calculating your difficulty of reaching the meeting. And so if you were actually going to do it sort of in a routing cost function, yes, we are geeks, woohoo, you would actually look at some of these and go, oh, wow, it's actually incredibly difficult to get from this part of Africa to that part of Africa without going through a metropolitan area in Europe because of the way the transport linkages are done. That means I think if we do this and say we're going to talk about these regions, we need to either be deliberately vague, or we need to say this is in effect a proxy for this other value, this transportation pain, because that's the reason we're giving for calling this particular one an appropriate choice for the nearby people to be in less pain and the far people to have a measurable equivalent pain. And I apologize that it is more difficult than either of the two choices you have in there, but I believe it's actually the alignment that we're really looking
So
for.
I believe there's like already text in there that kind of like goes in this direction, but I'm not sure how specific we can be. And I do understand the point. I just don't know like how to write text. Right now it's just like the goal of this is to distribute the travel pain. And more than that, it might be difficult, right? Like to say something generic about, let's say like South America, for example, right? When we met in Buenos Aires, like we thought of it as like South America, we're having a meeting, but a lot of the people are still remote. Even, I assume like even people from Argentina were remote. Like, I don't know if like the exact numbers, but there's a lot of people from Argentina, which is like a big country, who are also remote. And I assume like same thing is going to happen in China or India. So even if you go down to a country level, things are going to be still difficult. So I don't know how to write text for that, but it actually specifically states that this is like a proxy for travel pain and time zone pain.
Ted Hardy, perhaps you and I could work offline on some text about that.
Okay,
I'd be happy to help.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bob?
Hi, Bob Hinden. Well, first of all, I think the RAR thing and the geographic thing don't work very well in general for what we're trying to do. You know, Asia is way too broad. When we say Asia, we sort of mean Japan, China, you know, sort of Japan in that space. We don't tend to mean Saudi Arabia, which is also in Asia. No, it's not.
We don't tend to mean India.
Yeah, India's, yeah, even Singapore, where we're going, you know, this year is really, I mean, for me, it's like 2 long trips. And so it's, I think we maybe need something that works for us, which is, you know, maybe calling our clump of Asia something, and then I don't have words for it all, but so I don't think we want just continents, and I don't think the RAR thing works either. So maybe we can just define some groupings that work for us, or maybe we can find something.
Okay, so are you willing to help with text, Bob, on that?
Of course.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Kyle Rose. Yeah, the RIR thing seems like trying to mash something into a box that we already know. So
It is the goal, right? Because we want to be somewhat precise, because people are gonna like. So what has happened in the past is like we've been like very fuzzy, okay? Like I've seen people characterize Vancouver as Asia, okay? And like we don't want to be in that space, okay? So I think that's the kind of like clarity we need, but
I don't know. It feels like not achieving the point, which is the difficulty of travel. I look at the continent-based description as something more like a constraint but insufficient. It's basically saying, well, we want to be within this sort of general geographic region, but that's not sufficient to describe the limitation of where we want to hold the meeting. It's saying, all right, you know, like one out of 3 meetings is going to be in this general area of the world, but we're not going to hold a meeting in some place that is difficult for everyone to get to.
Exactly, but that is the intent of this document, right?
Sorry?
Is to give this like outline, and then the venue selection will actually take care of the rest. That is the intent. So what is stated is exactly the intent of this document.
Okay, good. Yeah, because it's not the case that every place in Asia is equally easy to get
Exactly,
to.
correct.
Right.
So
But
the
that
venue
doesn't- but that
selection
doesn't
will
mean
take
that
care
that
of the
doesn't mean
rest.
that stating Asia as one of the constraints is not useful. It's sort of like there's this additional implicit constraint that it's in Asia and in sort of an area where lots of people who work on this stuff already are, so it's easy for them to get to it.
So this may short circuit some folks who are at the mic, and if you've got additional, it sounds to me like we've got a plan to work out some text to capture this constraint between Suresh, Bob, and Ted. And if you think you'll be helpful to creating that text, please make a comment, but I think we know where we're going here.
Cover for RIPE NCC. I just want to mention, actually, I support the RIR model, and the reason is basically because of what Ted said, because RIRs in past 25 to 15 years, they all have held meetings in many countries in their region. So actually, there's a lot of experience, which I can talk for RIPE NCC, but I'm sure others as well, they're more than willing to share. So they know all the restrictions, they have lot of experience in that. Because RIR community is very much similar to IETF, so there's a lot of knowledge there which actually can be shared, and I think that's a very good reason. On top of that, I'm willing to
So
contribute.
is your point that like, so if you base it on RIRs, like we'll know who to talk to for the next stage?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect.
And I think that's very useful because all of these travel restrictions, many things have been experienced there. So that's one thing, and yeah, I'm willing to contribute text.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Barry?
This is Barry Lee, but based on what he said, I would prefer RIR model to anything else. But really what I came up here to say is that I would like to leave this, I very strongly think we should leave this to the discretion of the IAOC. We should be vague about what this means. And Ted, I think, will come up with good text for that.
Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Ole Jacobson. I just wanted to say that I hope the goal is not to come up with some sort of distance cost matrix, because if we try to do that, we're really screwed. I mean, it takes as long to get from Tokyo to Singapore as it gets from Tokyo to Berlin or something. So don't go there. These regions are not the same size.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay. So, and the last one is how to define the success criteria for exploratory meetings. And because people say, like, how do we know, like, you know, we had like a successful meeting, and how do you know, like, when to revisit this policy if, like, you know, successful meetings happen pretty frequently in some region, right? And so my suggestion, right, is to actually, whenever somebody suggests an exploratory meeting, so if somebody says, like, we need to meet in, I don't know, Greenland, right? And they suggest, like, why we should meet in Greenland and how we can measure the success of the meeting in Greenland, okay? And then the community sits on it, and when the community decides to go through with this meeting, and then they can measure the success based on whatever the proponents propose as like the success criteria. So I just want to hear thoughts on it. It's kind of like a hand-wavy thing, but I cannot think of anything better. Yari, you look concerned, but
Yeah. So I think that's actually fine. That's exactly the way we should go about it. I just was looking a little worried because we seem to categorize these exploratory meetings as, you know, we only go there because, you know, when I want to reach out to the, you know, Greenlanders or whatever. And that's not how I at least think about it. It's part of our normal program in the sense of, you know, we're going around in different places and arranging meetings, and we reach the usual people, or you know, maybe a few more additional ones or different ones than we have reached in different cases. But it's not very different from, you know, say meeting in Chicago, where we're just we're exploring because we're not going to the usual regions where we normally meet, but most of the meeting is still there for the purpose of all of us to meet. So it's not hugely different, I think. Otherwise, so the criteria is really the same.
okay. So I'll tell you what I thought about it, and then we can probably discuss further. But so my understanding was like going to an exploratory meeting had a higher bar than going between our regular regions. Okay, so I was thinking like somebody who wanted an exploratory meeting wants to explain the rationale for like going to a specific place for that meeting, and that's where this all started from, right? And so if somebody says, oh, let's go meet in wherever, like to meet Greenlanders, or like they say like, okay, like, you know, because of global warming or whatever, right? Like, you know, people say like, let's go and meet in Greenland because it's like awesome, right? Whatever, right? So, but they explain like why they do it, right? Because one of the things that is clear here is the exploratory meeting is like run by the community to figure out if we need to do it. So like somebody needs to say like why they want to do it, right? And that is where this is coming from. Oh, we want to do it this way, and this is how we're going to measure success, like after this meeting, or do we not want to even go there? Like we don't want to measure success. Like that is okay with me too, right? But because it did come up in like previous discussions, like how do we measure success of this, right? Other than like, you know, like a feel-good mentality, right?
I think that's fine. The only reaction that I was having is that, you know, if the requirements for going to Greenland are, you know, to work on the cooling designs, then, you know, that really shouldn't be the case. That's not the criteria, because we also need to meet and discuss, you know, quick and meeting venue and many other things. Okay. So that was basically more.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Yeah, I think I understand your point here.
Alyssa Cooper, we don't have success criteria for meetings, period. So
So out?
Well, it seems a little odd to start with a specific case. Like, or, I mean, it even seems a little unfair. Like,
it is
because
unfair.
how, you know what I mean? You're like asking people who are interested in just one subset of the meetings to do this, whereas like, we literally don't have it defined, as far as I know. We don't have it defined. We have a notion of like, oh, did more people come or less people come? Like, was it cash positive or negative? But it's not like we do an evaluation, a formal evaluation against any specific criteria for the meetings in general. So that might be a better thing to try and write down first.
Okay, so Alisa, I'll tell you my thinking behind this. Okay, so this is like not my personal thing, right? But the discussions, what happened is people said like we need a really good reason to go outside the beaten trail. Okay, so the bar is it's already unfair, right? That like exploratory meetings have like, so people don't have to like, you know, defend meeting in Chicago, right? Or like in Beijing, for example, right? So that's already unfair. The question is like, do we want to codify this or not? Because the exploratory meetings are always going to be a higher bar. So the question is, people say like, what did we achieve from going to da-da-da, right? Because you're going to get this question as chair, not, right? And the question is, do we even want to like formalize anything or not? Like, I fully agree, like we don't have success criteria. The question is, do we need to do this unfairly for this or not? And if it's not, like, I don't mind taking this out. I think it's very hard to do it, so I don't mind taking it out.
Yeah, Alyssa Cooper, I think it would be an interesting project to try and write down success criteria for the meetings generally first, and then you might end up, that would be the basis by which you tailor them, change them. You know, it would be by comparison to what the baseline criteria are, but that is a good chunk of work, I would imagine. And probably you don't want to hold up this document to do that piece of work.
Perfect, thanks. Meeting success boss in Prague.
Bob Hinden, I'm just going to suggest we not spend too much time in this. As far as I can remember, we've done this twice. We went to Australia in, what year was that?
2000.
Along 16 years ago. We went to Buenos Aires, what, last year, year before. We don't do this very often, right? It's not like it comes up, you know, every year or something. So, you know, it's a sort of almost out of cycle thing that we're going to always deal with an exceptional case. So
okay,
I think we should maybe note that, but I don't know if we need to try to define criteria for it.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Bob.
John Clenson. There's another reason why you shouldn't go down this path, which is that as soon as you decide that the way you're going to decide whether to go somewhere is to have success criteria stated by the proponents, you then need to have a discussion which probably explodes onto the IETF list about whether or not those are the right success criteria. And that is a colossal waste of community's time. I also find it interesting that the people who have been commenting mostly on your proposal are present, past, or future IOAC members, which may mean that we're not using this time really well. And the third observation, like it or not, is that for the last couple of years, the IETF has done a fairly persuasive job of convincing me to participate remotely. And parts of this discussion are reinforcing that message, and that's not clearly a good idea either.
Thanks. Okay, so this is gone. So I know like the three answers. So the second one is like probably something needs text. The other two are gone. Okay, so I have all my answers.
All right.
Okay, so I will like start the discussion on the second one with like Ted and Bob, yeah, and get back to the list with if you have some text. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Josh. Okay, with that, let's see, we still got some time, so we will jump back to Elliot's list.
While Elliot's getting back up, one thing I wanted to note, just administrivia. So Elliot's been using GitHub for an issues list, an issues tracker, which I think is fine, and we'll continue to do that. If you decide to put something into that issue tracker that is an issue, make sure that it is on the list so that discussion can take place. And I know that's a pain, but I think just administratively it's going to be easier for Charles and I if you are sure that the issue got mentioned on the list so that other people can participate in the discussion. Elliot.
Thank you. The grand slog continues. This is now issue number 6, I think. Terminology is hard to follow. Okay, and let's see here. Andrew, you're still in the room. Good, because this is one of yours. We're still going through. And here, I'm just going to read out a little bit. Right, so I think the issue here is that what you're saying, sorry, pardon me while I read for a moment. Okay, so this is tied to the earlier message.
Yeah.
Right, and in terms of whether we have the dimensionality, if you will, of categories. And you're looking for maybe an additional definition, as I understand it, of city, or you want to separate out. Do you want to talk to a little bit? Do you want to talk to this a little bit?
So this is Andrew Sullivan. This is part of that same worry that I had about various definitions, where I wanted, given that we had these definitions and we had a bunch of categories, some of which were mandatory, it seemed to me that you needed to have completely, you need to have the definitional set that was necessary and sufficient to cover all the cases. And I think there's a gap here. What I suggest for these definitional things is that maybe what we can do, just to like save time here at the microphone, is to try to go away and cover all of the cases, because that's probably going to be most effective if we do it via email or something. So unless you really object, I guess what I'm suggesting is that we could do this. The second piece, though, of the worry that I had here was this two-dimensional category problem, right? That the reason this made the reason that this worried me was because you had both the various categories into which things were, and then in there they were mandatory or important or whatever. And so you had this two-dimensional categorization, which meant that the definitions needed to be really tight in order to make any sense at all of what you were doing, because you didn't know how to trade. And so we had, both venue, and we had facility, and we had venue environs and so on. And maybe what we can do is spend some time going back and forth over all of the terms to make sure that we've got, sort of set theoretic coverage. Does that seem like a worthwhile thing? Probably not a thing to do in the microphone.
I think that's fine, because it gives us an opportunity to develop a proposal that we can take to the working group.
Okay.
And I'm perfectly happy with that. Okay, so that's what we'll do. And Andrew, I'll prevail on you to take the first step on that, by the way, with me. Okay, so then moving right along, don't go too far. There is the next issue is issue number 7, which is clarity of responsibility. And this relates to section 4.4 and 4.7. To be a whole lot clearer, the responsibility for venue selection rests ultimately the IOC, and that it's those people about whom the IETF participants should complain to NOMCOM if and when it is needed. Now, there is new text in the document. I want to say, actually, it was in section 5, though, that covers this. Let me just make sure that I have that right. It's at the top of section 5. And what is said in that section is the following are guidelines, sequence of states, and current practices. Such guidelines will likely need to evolve, and the IOC may change these guidelines. So what follows in section 5 is non-normative in a sense. And you are looking just for a clarification to say, hey, or a clear statement to say, got a problem, go to NOMCOM.
Well, yes. I think that the problem I had historically, and I should say that I thought I was done, and the only reason I'm here is because Pete prevailed upon me. So I haven't actually read the latest version of this. So you called me up here, so I'm going to stand here and talk. But normally I would sit down.
Open the issue.
So the key point about this is that I wanted to make sure that that everybody understands that the buck stops with the IOC on this venue selection thing. That's the NOMCOM responsible body. And my worry before was that there were various cases where it wasn't clear whether it was the meetings committee or the IOC that was responsible. The party responsible is always the IOC, and they gotta take the hits if something's wrong. So that's that was really the point of this concern.
Okay. So what I propose is to essentially put something along the lines of your text into the introduction. Are there any objections to that? Into the introduction, like section 1. Right. To make it, well, this should be front and center that as to the scope and purpose of this document.
And I have some memory in my reading of the 806 messages that Brian at some point suggested some text along these lines, and I will try and re-identify it if possible.
Right. What Brian had said, and I think what is also in the new version, is that the appeals process that is applicable for other IAOC things is applicable here. There's no change.
Right, but I thought he had also, and I think it was for another purpose, might have some text that might have satisfied Andrew. So, like I said, I'll try and dig it out because I saw it recently, and I wasn't reading all of the messages in order.
Okay. All right. So my action, though, at this point, unless I hear otherwise on list, is to just add some text into the introduction. Okay. Then issue number 8 is the target cities of list. What if the target cities of list is unknown? I think this relates, let me just get to section 5.1b, which is the non-normative text. Right, so a list of targets, what it says, so for people's benefit, what we're into here is section 5.1 is identification, and this is the non-normative discussion as what's there. Right, 4 years out, a process identifies cities that might be candidates for meetings. And so A is the IOC selects regions and
this is on the screen too, just for your reference.
Oh, thank you. Right. IOC selects regions and dates for meetings, and B is a list of target cities per region is provided to the Secretariat with host preferences, if known. Then Andrew's point is, what if the target list is not known? Is there something to do in that case? I think A precludes that problem, but maybe I misunderstood what your comment means. Right, which is the whole point of A, I think, is to identify those target cities, or maybe it's a terminology thing where between regions and cities, I'm not sure.
Again, when I read this, I was trying to understand you know, if I were an IAOC member and I wanted to follow this thing, what would I do? So this looks like a series of steps. And so step A, you select regions and dates. Step B, you've got a list of target cities per region is provided to the Secretariat with host preferences if known. I can't tell whether the if known is modifying the host preferences or modifying the list of target cities. And if the list of target cities is not known, what are you supposed to do here? Or is it the host preferences or whatever? So basically, I just don't understand this step.
Okay.
And this is Barry. I think the key here is that there's a missing step of finding target cities within the regions.
Okay.
This sounds strictly textual, and
okay, I will take it from there. I just didn't. Now I understand what the issue is. It's editorial. I can handle it. But yeah, just captured Barry's point there. That was Chris. Okay. Then we are down to concurrent objections. So this is also in that same section. And so it's should we provide a period for concurrent objection to the posted list? Let's just go back to the text. This is I'm trying to find the right point in that process. 5.2 similarly. Moment. So this is a consultation period, right? And this suggests that the IOC asks the community whether there are any barriers. The community responses are reviewed and concerns investigated. The IOC identifies which cities are to be considered. On a public webpage, the IOC lists all the candidate cities, and the meetings committee pursues potential meeting locations based on the posted list of cities that have been identified. So this is, transparency and other fun stuff. And Andrew's issue, right, is in 5.2, should we provide for a concurrent objection to the posted list? That is, it'd be nice if there were a way for people to say, I know you're already investigating this place. I still have concerns, so please look into. And so beyond that, Andrew, do you want to comment further? Or do you want to elaborate further? In particular, what concurrency do you want in this process? I take it is in step B that you're looking for some sort of...
To save Andrew a trip to the mic, I believe the issue is that A and B sound lockstep and as written, and maybe just making it clear that community responses can be coming in more continuously.
So I will indicate that editorially. That A and B can happen concurrently.
Right, or that B can continue to happen. Yeah, that community responses can continue to, as community responses come in, they are reviewed.
Or they're continuously evaluated or some such. Okay, I'll propose something. All right, moving right along. What happens if there's a change of policies in the interim? I think we have now covered this issue. So I'm gonna press on. Unless what we have said is that an exception process will be invoked when a mandatory criteria is becomes violated in some way over time, or the circumstances have changed. In which case, the IOC will invoke the exception process.
And this is, you said, after the contract, right?
After a contract is signed. Right. Before the contract is signed, as Tobias said, there is no exception process. Okay. Then we have strange text. Okay, so here I think what you're asking, this is Yachty's text at this point. So we moved from Andrew's message to Yachty's message. Welcome, Yachty. And so you say it's a bit strange and maybe not the whole truth. And this is the issue. I think this issue, it goes to whether attendance, the cash positive requirement should be mandatory is one I think this ties to as well. So your request is that would this text be added in addition? Is that clear? Am I understanding correctly?
This is Barry. I think the intent of this text that isn't clear and that maybe could be clarified is that we should not prefer maximizing attendance over other issues that make for a successful meeting. That I think this doesn't quite make that point clear.
Okay.
So increasing attendance is a goal, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of other things that make for a successful meeting. I think that's kind of where this is trying to go.
Okay, so that conflicts very clearly with what's actually the section header, what you just said. So, Bob?
Bob Hinden, two things. So last I looked, and maybe some, well, doesn't matter now, but I think it's actually meeting attendance covers less than half of the cost. Covers the meeting cost, but it that's more than half of it doesn't fund the rest of the IETF as much as it used to. So I'm not sure that's true, but attendance is not the only thing here. Of course, how much we charge for registration is a big part of this. So it's not just a single factor. Because we can change that by increasing the registration or reducing it.
I think your response to my comment, Elliot, this is Barry, makes I didn't make myself clear. Maybe it's just that trying to put a quick heading on this is the failure. It's a non-objective purely to maximize attendance. That said, we want to draw in new people, so increasing attendance is important. But it's not, the point here is that purely maximizing attendance is not the goal. And I don't know how you want to rephrase that, but I think that will fixing that will clarify this whole.
This is Andrew Sullivan. So I think that this text originated in a draft that Alyssa and I wrote, or anyway, the position originated there, and I actually disagree with Barry. I really think that maximizing attendance or increasing attendance or whatever is just not a goal. The goal is to get the work done. Now, it's true that you want to get the work done with people who are coming along and they show up and those are new attendees and so on. And so for that reason, you might end up changing the population of attendees and so on. But maximizing attendance or increasing the attendance or changing the population of people or anything like that is not a goal for the meeting or for the venue selection. And so that's the point here. That in fact, and I would actually go a little further because just speaking personally, one of the things that bothered me sometimes is that we sometimes talk as though having a successful meeting involves a large number of people showing up. And I have been in a lot of meetings where I felt pretty strongly, actually, that many fewer people would have been helpful. So it seems to me that in fact what we're trying to do is ensure that the venue selection aids the work of the IETF, not aids the work of having a big meeting.
Alyssa Cooper, I agree with the agreement between Barry and Andrew. I was also just going to say, I think defining this relationship between the venue location and the number of people who show up is maybe getting harder. So it's fine to establish maximal attendance as a non-goal, but it's possible, especially if we think about this document as a document we want it to be useful for a long time now, because we're not going to update it anytime soon after it gets published. I think the way that they establish it makes sense, but the notion of the opposite of that goal is probably a little bit hard to hit. Like, where would you put a meeting right now to maximize attendance? I don't know. Maybe not Chicago, it turns out, but it's just getting harder. So
I also agree with the agreements, and it's fine to have the maximized attendance as a non-goal. Just want to clarify why I had originally sent mail on this topic, and that was that while I agreed with the text, it also sounded slightly offensive, to be honest, and so I wanted to make clear that we actually are open. And when the IAOC has considered various meeting locations, the ability to maximize the easiness of contributors, either current or future, to be able to attend if they want to, has been a consideration, even though like maximal attendance in numbers isn't.
Okay, I think I have the gist of it. What I'll try and add some words around. I think I'm going to reword this slightly, the whole thing, to come very close to what Andrew actually said on this, and to make sure that it doesn't offend as well. So I think that's my action item. Okay. Okay. Then sponsor required is mandatory. As I do the chopping, I don't think we need to address this issue directly at this point. I think it's for other people to make. It'll be for other people to make the argument that in fact this is mandatory, and otherwise it's going to get marked down to important.
Alyssa Cooper. So just because this was on the issue list, I looked back at it, and I have a little more context and insight about this than I did like 4 or 5 weeks ago. And sort of similar to my previous point, I think it might even be worth rethinking this one a little bit, because again, if we want this document to live on for a long time, it's possible that there could be changes in the way that we structure the sponsorship and hosting programs that we have now, such that the tight coupling between one or a small number of sponsors and a specific meeting is not something that is a feature of every meeting in the future. Or there's other things that might change, or they might not change. But it would be nice to have a little more flexibility in terms of how we structure the sponsorship programs, and not have it be constrained by this criteria. So you can leave it as is, and people can comment on the text once it's produced, but that's just, it struck me going back to this.
I think, Alyssa, your proposal here is actually, if I'm reading you correctly, it's to remove this requirement.
Could be, or it could be to soften it in some way. I haven't thought through a specific proposal, but just because I looked at it again and I was like, oh, that seems overly constraining potentially.
Right.
So.
Okay.
Bob Minden, my issue is the mandatory word here, because if you're going to book hotels or venues 3 years or so out, it's impossible. It's very hard to find hosts for sponsors for them that early. So that means you will have to wait till a year out, and you can't find anything. So it's desirable to pick the venues that you think you might be able to get sponsors or hosts or something, but you can't make it a hard requirement, because then you won't have any places. Right. Then you will be finding sponsors first. Where do they want to have a meeting? It turns the whole thing around. This is one of the reasons why 10 years ago we try to move it to 3 years out, because it would give us more flexibility in finding venues.
So just in my mind, in terms of this requirement, we're teetering between desirable and removing.
Well, and I mean, that may be true, but it may also be a splitting of this particular issue, because the extreme version of what I'm hearing Alyssa say is hosts and sponsors in the future may not be an issue at all. And if the point is we need to figure out a way to pay for the meeting, which is already a requirement up above, and how that meeting gets paid for, whether it's through hosts or sponsors or some other method, may be this may be anachronistic.
Right. Yes. So I think it's desirable. I think it's good to get some sort of sponsors, but it's going to change. So it shouldn't be, it should be something to consider, not have to do it. And there may be reasons in certain regions, you know, if we want to have a meeting at all, then that's going to be harder. So this needs a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, Jarkko, I think I'm personally leaning more towards removal. There's ways to rephrase this. So, you know, one way to rephrase this might be to say something about, you know, the venues, you know, not being, you know, offensive in some way. Like, you know, IETF sponsors don't want to be associated with a particular place that we're going to. That might be a case. We certainly don't want to go into a place like that. But this is problematic as originally written in multiple ways. One reason was what Alisa was saying, and then the other one is that we sort of, IETF has failed in the sponsorship process a number of times because we were too focused on local sponsors. We go out of our way, far out, and you know, maybe there's actually less money available, less business there than there's in some of these global companies. And we insisted on using local sponsors, and then we didn't actually get any, and that's a problem. So I think we're moving out of that model for multiple different reasons, and so I'd strike the whole thing.
Okay, before we go
Plus
further.
one to remove.
Okay, unless there's any objection, I think we have a proposal on the table to remove, and unless people object, I'm just going to remove it.
This is Andrew Sullivan. I certainly don't object to removing it, but it probably means that you've got another issue, which is that somewhere the idea that that the funding model that we're using overall for the IETF at the time is bound up in some way with this meeting selection, and that needs to be reflected somewhere, right? Because that's part of the way that this made it in there in the first place. This is a description of current practice because we currently fund the IETF partly by getting sponsors for meetings, and then the meeting is supposed to be cash positive, and we're supposed to like somehow fund the IETF that way. And so that's, I think that's a piece of what this requirement is, and so we're going to need to create a space for that. I know that's pretty vague, but
So
it means you've got another issue.
Andrew, right now there is a cash positive criteria in the document. Do we need? Are you saying there's something else that needs to be said?
The different thing here is that the one of the points that's captured in this requirement, which I'm still in favor of removing the particular text, is that what you're trying to do is get sponsorship to increase the the value of the meeting to the organization, right? So what you're trying to do is attract sponsorship. That's the way we do it right now. If the overall financial approach that the IETF takes changes dramatically, then those specific mechanisms go away. But the point is rather that what we're trying to do, what we've got right now is a selection criterion that is somehow bound up with overall IETF financial issues in a way that has implications for what kind of thing you select. Did that clarify at all, or did I just go like so completely abstract that it didn't help?
Clear as mud, but it covered the ground.
Yeah, well.
As a mud author, I can absolutely work with that.
Okay.
No, what I'm going to do, I think, is I'll probably send a note to the list to follow this up. I think removing this requirement and replacing it with something that says that the meeting has to fit within, as an important but not mandatory requirement, that the meeting has to fit within the financial model of the IAOC and ISOC is probably what you're aiming towards. Okay. And somehow I don't think we had to tell you that.
I think that was actually part of my confusion in interpreting you is I don't know how an IAOC could choose to do otherwise, but I don't think there's a problem with putting in such guidance.
That's Diego, let me put in some vote for it. I mean, if we come up with if there's a venue that the community thinks is awesome, then why can't we just go there already? Here's a reason why we can't.
Thank you. That helped.
Okay. All right, so now we're up to repeats. So this is again from Yachty. And you're wondering if we're hiding important things in the details in the part before Horace, and that this involves the IS at 2.0. So here, what you're saying is, it's not clear you're saying that there's any change here, but I'm not sure what textual change you want, Bobby.
I'm not sure there was a particular change. This was more of a discussion item, how we approach things. So no requirement saying change per se.
Okay, so I'm gonna leave that alone then. Okay, and we should close that issue.
So you want to close it with nothing's needed?
Nothing's needed, right?
Nothing's needed at this time.
If
Okay.
people want to discuss, they can discuss.
Can you scroll up for a second?
Yep.
Which part did you want to see? What is currently in the document? Okay, yeah, up at the top there.
And this is desired. It's not important. It's not mandatory.
Alyssa Cooper. Again, sort of looking at this with fresh eyes and new information. So this is specifically about well, it says it's the venue, but we don't contract with a country or a city. So it's also sort of about the facility. It might be nice to broaden it a little bit. Like after we've done, because a lot of the criteria are about the city and not specifically about the venue. And so if it is the case that in general, the IETF community wants to support the notion that going back to the same city is a good idea, that would be useful to have separately from going back specifically to the same facility.
Okay, I can do that editorially. Charles, you need to unclose it.
We didn't close it.
He never got to push the button as he was scrolling back up. So
Good. All right, then we're up to, all right, this is one where...
and I will give you a 13-minute warning if that changes which ones you want to hit first.
Okay. So this is one where Yachty wasn't the only person who I think suffered some confusion as to why we have two different requirements regarding accessibility versus wheelchair access. And here, I'm wondering if I could prevail on Dave, actually, maybe make a few comments on how this came to be. Would you be okay doing that?
Dave Crocker, there's long ago postings on the mailing list about this. It reduces to something pretty simple. Wheelchair access is a very specific physical, straightforward capability. It's easy to assess its availability, and it has a very broad usefulness beyond just people who need wheelchairs. All of the other accessibility and handicap assistance capabilities are much more complicated. Their availability around the world is much more varied and very difficult to assess. And so a very specific requirement for wheelchair access that's concrete seemed appropriate, and a second requirement that was fuzzier, intentionally fuzzier, seemed appropriate.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate it. So one of the things that I think we'll see is we'll need to have the argument about whether wheelchair access, even though it's specific, whether it is actually mandatory, as in can we hold a meeting without in a place that does not have wheelchair accessibility. And but I'm tempted to put forward that PR myself, but I would again want people to test me on it and that it's well justified. And perhaps the IAOC can also chime in terms of how many people do require this service.
Tobias Gondom, IOC head off, so really just me. I think the default applies, put it in important. And of course the rule applies that we follow local laws always. In most countries there is a law for accessibility and wheelchair access. So yeah, that should be sufficient.
Yeah, if it becomes important, then I might combine these two.
So, Elliot, then what do you want me to capture here that's going to be helpful for you?
Right, so it looks at the moment that it's going to get demoted to important, that I may argue for something more than that, but if it stays important, I will combine these two.
Ted Hardy, clarifying question. I thought I understood Tobias to be saying that because this is legally required, and we require ourselves to obey the laws of the country in which we're in, to the extent we're in charge of it, that we would then not be willing to put up anything that created a barrier to wheelchair accessibility where one did not already exist. That's the sort of legal requirement on the on us. It's like we don't like put steps in the way of things that would otherwise be accessible, and that he believes it is covered otherwise by law. So the question I think we have is, do we have this as a condition that we meet only in places where this is covered by law? And if that is not a condition, then I believe it remains at its previous strength.
You swallowed the last three words of the sentence, which seemed important to me.
I apologize. Ted Hardy again, trying to unswallow his last three words. That if we do not have a requirement that we only meet in countries or territories which have such a law, then I believe it retains its previous strength for the reasons Dave articulated.
Leslie Daigle, just wanting to add a bit of color to the conversation. I don't think it's that easy. I think that we can write down the objective minimal requirements quite easily. You know, quote unquote wheelchair accessibility. There are laws. Any of the major hotels we're going to deal with are going to support this. But at the same time, then we hear the stories of how hard it is to actually make a booking if you actually need wheelchair access to be confident that you're going to get the room that meets your particular accessibility needs. And that's actually the harder problem and potentially the more germane issue. And then to your question, Elliot, about how many people actually have these requirements, there are people that have these requirements in our community and will have them every time they come. And then there's, you know, those of us who stepping out of the garden shed in the winter and have a nasty ankle break, and all of a sudden we need them for the next meeting.
Bob didn't agree with what Leslie said. One exception, there are laws in countries about things in that country. Every country is different. You can't cite them. And so it gets, you know, I think there was some earlier version that tried to point to the US one, but you can't go to a country. You can't go to a country, you know, you can't go to Asia and say you have to follow the US ADA requirements. That just doesn't work. So it's hard to deal with, and different countries are in very different places about what they require.
Tobias Gondrom, yes, I'm very much plus oneing to Bob's point. You cannot impose the laws of the United States for everywhere in the world, okay? Well, you can choose, yeah, okay, but I overstated this. You cannot impose the laws of one country or choose any law of one country and impose it on everybody. And I believe if we name something as very important, you know, this is still important. Yeah, just because it's not mandatory doesn't mean we don't care about it. And I think this should be sufficient.
And this is a complex world. Not everything is perfect. And I think we need to accept that.
Ted Hardy. I disagree with my colleague on this point, and I believe that the important thing here is to give very clear guidance on what we believe is the levels of accessibility which result in us being open to people who have different characteristics, physical characteristics. And having spent a summer in a wheelchair, I can guarantee you that many, many places do not meet it. And if we are going to name it as important, we will end up in a lot of them.
Okay, I detect that there are differing views on this that need to be developed, and my inclination in this case is because this text has been really gone over with a fine-tooth comb, that apart, notwithstanding what was said earlier, I want to, based on this conversation, I think I want to leave things alone until there's a specific proposal to how we change it to go forward.
My proposal, Ole Jacobson, would be to remove any reference to local laws, because it has absolutely nothing to do with that. It has to do with whether the facility has sufficient facilities for access.
There is no current text in this part about local laws.
Okay.
Yeah.
I apologize. I just try to want to clarify one thing. So I also feel very strongly that the location choice is not excluding anyone. Okay, so I'm fully, maybe this came across the wrong way when I said it before. I feel very strongly that this is critical and important. I also feel that maybe you have different ways of solving the same thing. And sometimes one law says like, oh, you need to have maybe a ramp with maximum 10 degrees tilt. Another says maybe 5 degrees tilt. And I think when it comes to that, frankly, I think that's something where we need to be a little bit more open, okay, how you solve this accessibility. I think the goal is the essential part, like to be open and accessible to the people, not how much the tilt is or like whether your door opens 2 meters or 1 meter 50. And I apologize for...
No, so, but I think this goes back to Elliot's point, which is without a proposal for a change of the current text that sufficiently covers, let's leave the current text as it is. I believe that was our conclusion on this one.
I'll leave alone. All right, moving on.
And yeah, let's make this our last issue. And if it goes more than a minute or two, we'll make it our not last issue, but the previous one will be our last issue.
So then this one, this text I was just looking at, this is, and there is some overlap in these. The first deals with, I think, mostly AV requirements. And the second...
Is this the 3-month final check? Which one are you doing?
This
Number
is
15?
distinction between these two requirements?
Number
or did I miss
15.
one?
Nope, we got it. Number 15.
Okay. All right. So the first requirement is not just around, okay, I'm sorry. The first one is around unfiltered networking, and the second one is around, one is around the IETF hotels, the other is around the facility. That is the difference between these two requirements. So I think this is also from Yari. And based on Warren's comments earlier, I think there's probably some slight rewording to be done here that references your network operations requirements, and I'll be contacting you about that. And if I can manage it, I will. I'll combine these, but I don't make a promise on that. Okay.
I think the distinction that was being made was that in the case of the facility, in the case of the hotel, they might help us get that access. Facilitate was the additional bit.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I don't know if the network operations requirements cover both of these points, but if they do, we'll just take those into account and reference off that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. That was the ultimate. one that we're going
I
to
think
do?
so. We have a precisely 43 seconds left.
Okay, then thank you.
All right. I think we have reached as much of the agenda as we can. As we said at the beginning, we're going to continue to add to the issues list. We'll try and bring things up on the list as needed. We are going to solicit that review from the Secretariat and put that on the list. Anything else we need to deal with before we close? Thank you all for attending. I seem tomato free.
Yeah, of course.
No eggs, no tomatoes.
I have a question. What do you think is the timeline for this draft?
Oh.
It already happened according to our miles.
So we have to update. I mean, the three of us went into taking up this work on this would be a short term.
Yes, I remember.
So,
That's why I'm asking.
yeah. We need to see how long it takes Elliot to gather all of these issues and get a read out. Certainly months, not years, but I don't think I can promise months, not months.
I don't ask you to promise anything. I'm just asking. Let me explain why I'm asking. It's because there is a number of potential locations